One of the most interesting and intriguing stories in the Old Testament is the story about David, who stayed home from a battle, and he had an affair with his next door neighbor, Bathsheba. It was an affair that got out of hand because she became pregnant, and the king decided he was going to try to cover it up. So he actually arranged to have Bathsheba's husband Uriah killed in battle. Now, he did this by giving commands to the leader of his army, and Uriah was put in a place where he was going to die. And you might argue, well, kings do these things, but that was immoral. As immoral as having an affair with his next door neighbor. And David was guilty of murder as well as adultery. God was not silent. He sent a prophet by the name of Nathan to go and meet with David. Now, I've tried to put myself in Nathan's shoes. I can't imagine, Nathan doesn't see God, but God holds eternity in his hands. But Nathan can see the king, and the king's got a palace guard, and they have the authority to put him to death. He could have been put to death as quickly and as easily as Uriah was put to death. But he obeys God, and he goes to talk to the king, King David, the greatest king who ever ruled over the people of Israel. You can find the story of what takes place in 2 Samuel chapter 12. And it's an intriguing story. If you haven't read the story recently, I encourage you to go to 2 Samuel 12 and read the story. Because it's as intriguing and suspenseful as any TV show, Dateline 2020, you've ever come across. Because Nathan goes and he confronts David, but he does it in a way that is so unique. I wish you and I could learn the method that God instructed Nathan to use when Nathan confronted the sin of his king. Because he goes to David and he tells a story. He says, one time there was a rich man and a poor man. They lived in the same village. And the rich man was very rich. He had lots of animals. Lots of them. And the poor man had one ewe lamb. And he raised that lamb as if it were his child. The lamb ate with him and slept with him. That lamb was with him constantly. He cared for that lamb. And one day the rich man had a visitor arrive. And when the visitor arrived, the tradition in that time was you prepare for them a very nice meal. But instead of using one of his many animals in his herds, he went and he forcibly took the ewe lamb from the poor man. And that's what he slaughtered, and that's what he prepared for his guest. And Nathan tells that story to King David. And according to what we have recorded for us in 2 Samuel chapter 12, David exploded in anger. And he says, as surely as I'm the king, the man who did this will be punished. He should be put to death. Moreover, it shouldn't just be put to death. He ought to be able to pay 4 times back what he took from the poor man. And the story, the record that we have in 2 Samuel chapter 12 is Nathan looked at King David and said, "You're that man. You're that man. You took what Uriah valued the most, and you stole it from him. And then you had him put to death." And David is confronted with the reality of his sin. And that takes me to the text that I want to focus on this morning, which is Psalm 51. Because in Psalm 51, we have recorded for us David's pleading with God for forgiveness and restoration. He starts out by saying, "Have mercy on me, mercy. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love." Now, we don't really talk about mercy very much. In fact, I think mercy and grace are two terms that we use around church and church people and Bible studies, but we don't really grasp the depth of mercy. Because mercy is when someone withholds from us the punishment that we deserve. Mercy is when someone withholds from us the punishment that we deserve. And God is being asked by David, "Have mercy on me, God. Don't give me what I deserve." David knows from the story that Nathan told that even in David's eyes, he should be put to death. David knows this. He knows that his sin is so detestable before God that he should die for his sin. And so he begs God for mercy. Don't give me what I deserve. But according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Blot out my sin. Transgressions is another word for sin. We're going to come across another one in a minute because he says, "Wash me, wash away all my iniquity." Another word for sin. "And cleanse me from my sin." So in one sentence, he's used transgressions and iniquity and sin. He is fully aware of how much he has sinned. Let me remind you, everybody, God sees us. God sees us. God sees you. God sees not only what you have done, but he sees what you're thinking, and he sees what you're going to do before you even do it. God sees us. And one of the realities of this psalm, one of the realities of this truth, is that shattered pride and crushed hearts never escape God's notice. Shattered hearts, shattered pride and crushed hearts never escape God's notice. Have you ever come to that place where you just felt like everything had gone wrong, that you had failed, that your sin, your pride, everything you counted on was just crushed and shattered? That was David. That was David at this moment. He says, God, take away my sin, my transgressions, my iniquity. Have mercy on me. He says, for I know my transgressions and my sin are always before me. I always know what my sin is. I kind of think that you probably do too. We're really good at categorizing it. We're really good at putting it in a box and trying to set it over here. We're really good at ignoring that still small voice in us that convicts us of our own sin and our own shortcomings. We're really good at building walls around our sin and our iniquity. We're really good at that. But David admits, it's always there. And then he makes this statement. And I think that this is one of the most profound things that we find in this psalm. Because David says, against you, and you only, have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. Now you say, but he did sin against Bathsheba and Uriah, and he tried to deceive his general who was leading the troops. Yes, right. But who was the primary person that David tried to deceive? That was God. And you and I sit here, and we can sit on our high horse, and we say, well, that was pretty foolish. I mean, if God sees us, and God knows everything we do, and He knows what we're thinking before we even take action, then how could you ever deceive God? Exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly what we're learning here. And David goes on and he says, so you're right. You are all right when you're in your verdict and justified when you judge me. And God is, isn't He? He's God. And He set the bar and He set the standard. And He says, this is what is right and this is what is wrong. And then we're left in this position where we deal with consequences and we receive forgiveness, but we also deal with judgment. We deal with consequences. You know, this is, I think, one of the hardest things for people to understand outside of Jesus. Because it takes Jesus in our lives, it takes our commitment to following Him for us to even begin to comprehend what it means to deal with consequences and yet still be forgiven. Because in our culture, if I forgive you for some wrong against me, your assumption is that I'm going to wipe away all the consequences. But any of you that has ever parented children know that system of discipline doesn't work. Because if children don't receive some consequences because of their behavior, they don't learn anything. And as an adult, I'm exactly the same way. The consequences of our sin, God doesn't promise to take away. I don't know of any examples in Scripture where He took away people's consequences because of their sin, but He forgave them. He totally forgave them. But they still had to deal with the consequences. And the result of that is what we refer to as judgment. God knows and He understands that forgiveness is important, but He also knows and understands that we don't learn anything unless we have consequences. Remember what we said? Shattered pride and crushed hearts never escape God's notice. Because those shattered hearts, because that crushed pride doesn't escape God's notice, we know that He still loves us. Just like a child knows, even when they're being punished, that mom and dad still love them. David goes on, he says, surely I was sinful at birth. Even from the very beginning of time in my mother's womb, when I was conceived, I was sinful. Yet you desired faithfulness even in the womb. You taught me wisdom in that secret place. I want to remind us all of something. Wisdom, the wisdom that comes to us from the day we're born, that wisdom allows us to know the difference between right and wrong. That's what wisdom is. It's looking at life and seeing myself from God's perspective, but it's also recognizing that I know the difference between right and wrong. I've said this many times before. I never had to teach any of my kids how to say no. They knew how to say it. And they look at me and defy me and say, no. And here's the reality. We do this to God all the time. We do it to Him all the time. We want to pretend somehow that God doesn't know us, that God doesn't see us, that He doesn't know the depth of our hearts, that He doesn't see through all of our sin. But he sees us for who we really are. Now, one of the most intriguing things about God is he can see me and he can see you, and he can understand that we're broken, fallen people and still love us. But what parent who sees their child's opposition, who sees their child's sin, doesn't still love that child? Why is it so hard for us as adults to recognize that in spite of who we are, God still loves us? In spite of who we are, what never escapes God notice is our pride and our hearts when they're shattered and crushed. So David says, cleanse me, wash me, purify me, cleanse me with hyssop. That was like their bleach, okay? Cleanse me with bleach, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. They knew of nothing that was more white than snow. They didn't see snow very often in the Middle East. They still don't. But they know that when snow comes, it's really white. So David prays, he sings, he writes this poem, and he says, cleanse me with the bleach and make me clean. Wash me so that I can be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed, my pride and my heart, rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquity. Blot it out. Have you ever blotted something out? I have blotted things out. Sometimes I got in trouble for blotting things out. My dad loved fountain pens, okay? And my dad had fountain pens where you had to have a jar of ink, and there was a little lever on the side of that fountain pen that you pumped it up so that you could get the ink inside that fountain pen. And my dad loved those pens. And I remember one time I decided to play with his fountain pen. I blotted out all the papers on his desk and left an ink stain in the middle of his desk that was, well, it was still there when I left that desk in the basement of a house because we didn't want to move it one more time. I mean, that ink bottle spilled all over everywhere. And I had it on my hands. And I remember at supper that night being asked, my brother and I, my brother's 2 years younger than me, who was playing with the ink at my desk? Not me, Daddy. I lied to his face. He said, let me see your hands. Man, I wasn't caught red-handed. I was caught black-handed because they were black with ink. And David says to God, blot it out. God, blot out my sin. Cover my sin. Cover my sin. And he was saying something that he didn't even understand how prophetic it was. Because Jesus comes along and he blots out our sin with his blood. And he covers our sin with his blood. David didn't even know that yet. But he says, God, blot it out. You see, the finished work of Jesus, covers your sin and my sin. No matter how dark that sin is, no matter how detestable that sin is, Jesus' finished work covers our sin. It's ours to experience, and he gives it to us freely. There are no strings attached. There's nothing we can do to earn it because it's a gift. That's called grace. Remember we talked earlier about mercy is when God withholds what we deserve. Grace is when he gives us what we don't deserve. He gives us gifts so valuable that we don't deserve them, and that's God's grace. And that's because our shattered pride and our crushed hearts never, ever escape God's notice. David learned that. So then we come to probably the most well-known verses in Psalm 51. Songs have been written about this verse. And David says, "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." See, this is so like the language that Paul uses in his letters to the churches, where he says that God is making in us a new creation, that God is restoring to us the joy of our salvation, that God is making in us pure hearts and steadfast spirits. That's what God does. It doesn't mean he takes away all the consequences of our sin. It doesn't mean that we're relieved of all the pain that we've caused ourselves and the people around us because of our sin, but it does allow us to experience pure hearts and steadfast spirits. And David says, don't cast me away. Don't throw me aside. Don't cast me from your presence. Don't take your Holy Spirit from me, but restore to me that first joy that I had when I came to know you for the very first time. Restore that to me and grant me a willing spirit. A willing spirit. Why does David say a willing spirit? Because guess what, folks? It takes a willing spirit on my part and your part to say, yeah, Daddy, I'm the one who spilled that ink. That's why my hands are all black. And some of you need to say that to God about your sin. Yeah, Daddy God, I did it. And I need you to restore to me the sense of forgiveness and renewal, a fresh start. Because we all long for a fresh start. And God does that because our shattered pride and our crushed hearts never escape his notice. David begins to wrap this up by saying, "Deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed." One of the things that Nathan told David is he said, "David, you've been guilty of a lot of bloodshed." And he was. David was a warrior all his life. David had killed lots and lots of people. And God said, because so much bloodshed has come against your house, you too are going to experience death in ways that you have never experienced death. So deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed, O God, because you are my God and my Savior, and my tongue will sing of your righteousness. My tongue will sing of your righteousness. So open my lips, Lord. Open my mouth. Help me declare your praise. You see, that's the result of becoming this new creation. That's the result of you and me experiencing God's creative power in us, because creation has never stopped. Creation was not done in 7 days. Creation was not done when the first 3 chapters of Genesis were finished. God continues his creative power. I believe that's why the astronomers of our age continue to discover new galaxies and new stars and new universes, because I believe that God is still out there creating. I don't think his creative power has ever stopped, but his creative power is not only exhibited in the universe and the stars of the sky, but his creative power is at work in you and in me. That's what he wants us to experience. That's what David is saying. God, I want to experience the fullness of your creative power at work in me. I need a fresh start. I need to be a new creation. And the wonder of all wonders for me, Maybe it escapes you, but the wonder of all wonders for me is God does that for David. David's best years are not behind him when his sin with Bathsheba takes place. David's best years are still in front of him. Your best years, your best days, your best times of following Jesus are in front of you, not behind you. That's what we talk about when we say we want to inspire people to follow Jesus. Because the best is still coming. It's not past. And that's because when we do run headlong into failure and pain and suffering and grief, into disease and all the things that go with it, it never escapes God's notice. Our shattered pride and our crushed hearts never escape God's notice. Because God doesn't delight in our sacrifice. I mean, that's one of the things that David recognizes. And he says, God, you don't delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You don't take pleasure in burnt offerings. And this, it ought to cause us a little bit of a brain pain, because the whole system of worship that Moses established for the people of Israel involved sacrifices and burnt offerings. That's what he laid out in front of them. He says, this is how you worship me, and this is how you get forgiveness of sin. You bring me sacrifices, you make burnt offerings. But God didn't do that because he delights in it. God did that because he knows that on our part, some method of giving up has to take place. We have to let go. We have to present to him something. Paul goes so far as to say in Romans chapter 12 that we present ourselves to God like a living sacrifice. And indeed, that's what Jesus had already done, isn't it? He presented himself as a living sacrifice to God, and they nailed him to a cross for crimes he didn't commit. And David says, my sacrifice, O God, my sacrifice? That's my shattered pride and my broken heart. And I know you won't despise that, God. I know you'll see that. I know that won't go unnoticed. My shattered pride, my crushed heart. So what do we see here? We see that God's verdict is all of us fall short of his standard. That's God's verdict. And then we see that in the place of that verdict by God, there's mercy. There's God-ordained mercy. I am so grateful for God's mercy. And I'm grateful for his restoration, because he comes along and he restores us. He restores you. He restores me. He does that out of love. He does that because he cares. He does that because he's not interested in burdening you with guilt and shame. He only allows guilt and shame to come into our lives so we can experience his mercy and his restoration. That's the only reason we have those things, is because God wants us to experience his mercy and his restoration. He sends his verdict because he knows that until our pride is shattered and our hearts are crushed, we don't even know that we need his mercy or know that we need his restoration. Our shattered pride and our crushed hearts never escape God's notice, ever. My question this morning for each of you is, have you experienced that? I believe that each one of us in our own way have these niches, these hidden places in our hearts and our lives where we're hoping God doesn't see. We're hoping that God doesn't know what's going on. We're hoping He doesn't see what we do when nobody's looking over our shoulder and we've got the computer screen on. We hope somehow in some weird way that God doesn't see us when we're doing things that abuse our bodies. We're hoping somehow that God doesn't see or hear us when we tell that little lie that is just going to snowball and become something bigger. We hope that God doesn't look and see when we're pretending to be better than we really are. We want God to somehow ignore us. Yeah, God can't do that. He won't do that. That's not in His nature. Because He loves you too much to do that. He loves you too much to ignore you, or to pretend that something you have done hasn't been done at all. So this morning, are you ready to join David in saying, God, have mercy on me. God, restore to me the joy of my salvation. God, help me to not only see my brokenness, but to see your power at work in me to renew a right spirit in me. Are you ready to say that to God this morning? Can you say that to God this morning? Will you say that to God this morning? You see, our crushed pride, and it'll crush your pride, and our shattered hearts won't ever escape God's notice. He cares that much about you. The disciple He loved the most, John, writes to us and he says, that God is faithful and just. If we ask Him for forgiveness, He will cleanse us from all unrighteousness. All of it. All we have to do is ask. And He's ready to do that.